Rumors slipped through the pits. Smokey Yunick was back. A black and gold Camaro wore 13 like an omen. Before Bonneville, he rolled into Riverside. Journalist Jim McFarland watched as Indy veteran Lloyd Ruby lapped quicker than the prior year's pole. Then the car vanished onto a trailer. Weeks later, the same machine ran past 180 mph on the salt, enduring a 12-day siege that reset over 300 FIA and USAC records with drivers like Mickey Thompson and Curtis Turner. But the story isn't just numbers, it's loopholes and one creed: if the rules don't forbid it, it's legal. What was Smokey really hiding? What was happening, and how did one Camaro make a mockery of limits? Let's analyze in this video how Smokey Yunick turned the Bonneville Camaro into a rule-breaking legend. In the smoky garages of late 1960 America, racing was more than competition. It was theater, politics, and survival. Among the mechanics, one man refused to play the part assigned to him. Henry "Smokey" Yunick wasn't the polished face of Detroit engineering. He was rough, unshaven, and unapologetically blunt, with a cigar dangling like punctuation to every sentence. While corporate teams poured millions into research, Smokey relied on grit and cunning. To him, the rulebook wasn't a boundary, it was an opportunity. Each vague line, each oversight by officials, was a door waiting to be kicked open. Where others saw restrictions, Smokey saw riddles begging to be solved. That philosophy terrified sanctioning bodies but electrified fans who longed for someone bold enough to challenge the establishment. The clearest glimpse into Smokey's defiance came during a NASCAR inspection. Officials were certain he had cheated with an oversized fuel tank. They ripped it from the car, confident they'd caught him. Without missing a beat, Smokey struck a match, lit his cigar, and drove the car away, because he had engineered the fuel line itself to hold nearly 2 gallons. It was a lesson not just in innovation, but in audacity. His quip, "They never said I couldn't," became more than a defense. It was his creed, a rallying cry against conformity. But Smokey's defiance wasn't reckless, it was calculated. He knew that spectacle mattered as much as speed. Reporters wrote about his antics with fascination, sometimes outrage, always intrigue. Rival teams complained, but they also studied him, desperate to decode his methods. Smokey thrived in that tension. For him, victory wasn't crossing the finish line first, it was forcing the sport to admit it could not contain him. And so, when Chevrolet unveiled its sleek new Camaro in 1967, the corporate world saw a competitor to Ford's Mustang. Smokey saw something else, the perfect blank canvas for his next rebellion. He imagined a car that would not just bend rules, but twist them into knots, a car so cunning it would humiliate rivals, while leaving inspectors speechless. That vision would give birth to the black and gold number 13 Camaro, a machine destined to haunt Bonneville, terrify Ford, and etch Smokey's name deeper into racing legend. The stage was set not for compliance, but for revolution. By 1967, the American pony car wars were raging. Ford's Mustang had already lit the fuse, dominating both showroom sales and racetrack prestige. Chevrolet's answer? The Camaro was fresh from the factory, sleek, wide, with a stance that begged for competition. Most engineers saw it as a promising newcomer. Smokey Yunick, however, saw it as raw clay. In his Daytona shop, away from Detroit's corporate gaze, he envisioned something darker. The Camaro would not just race, it would disrupt. And in Smokey's hands, it began to shed its stock identity. Panels were stripped, geometry altered, and aerodynamics toyed with in ways that bordered on madness. This wasn't just a car being prepared for competition. It was being weaponized. The heart of Smokey's plan lay under the hood. He built 2 power plants to suit his double-edged vision. One was a nimble, small block, delivering 445 horsepower, fast, rev-happy, designed for precision attacks on the track. The other was a brute, a 540 horsepower big block disguised so carefully it could masquerade as a legitimate heavy-duty catalog option. Together, they offered Smokey flexibility to strike however he pleased. Yet the most unsettling part wasn't the power, it was the disguise. On paper, the car appeared ordinary. Catalog parts, standard transmissions, the kind of specifications any inspector expected to see. But to those who glimpsed it in Smokey's garage, the machine radiated something more sinister. The black paint shimmered with menace. The gold numerals seemed to dare competitors to challenge it. And the number 13, chosen deliberately, was no accident. It was Smokey's middle finger to superstition and conformity, a declaration that he would build his own luck. Whispers spread quickly. Was this Camaro truly a Z28? Or was it something entirely fabricated? A phantom car crafted in secrecy? Rivals lost sleep over the uncertainty, and that paranoia was part of Smokey's genius. He wasn't just building horsepower, he was building myth. As the number 13 Camaro rolled quietly from the Daytona garage, the mood in racing circles shifted. This wasn't a factory-backed car. It wasn't a corporate experiment. It was a weapon, designed by one man who had made a career out of dismantling rules. And soon, Smokey would prove just how dangerous it was, not with paperwork or blueprints, but with a performance that would rattle Ford to its core before the salt flats of Bonneville ever came into view. From a distance, Smokey Yunick's Camaro looked like it had just rolled out of a dealership lot. Inspectors glanced at the paperwork and ticked off every line. Muncie 4-speed? Check. Posit traction rear end? Check. Leaf springs? All present. By every visible measure, this car played by the book, and that was precisely the illusion Smokey intended. The true genius of the number 13 Camaro wasn't the raw power under its hood, it was the deception built into its very bone. Rivals studying the car felt a creeping unease. They could see nothing illegal, yet they knew they weren't facing an ordinary machine. It was like staring into a mirror that didn't reflect the truth. Behind that facade lay an arsenal of invisible tricks. The subframe had been sliced and re-welded, subtly lowering the center of gravity without leaving obvious scars. The windshield leaned back just enough to steal precious miles per hour through improved aerodynamics. Even the car's underbody had been smoothed, a detail that most wouldn't notice until the Camaro cut through air like a fighter jet. The most audacious touch, however, was Smokey's weight reduction program. Through acid-dipped panels, the Camaro shed pounds without shedding legality, turning metal into paper-thin skin that still passed visual inspections. The brilliance wasn't just in the engineering, but in the psychology. Officials were trapped. They couldn't disqualify what they couldn't prove. Rivals were paranoid, convinced Smokey had built something outside the bounds of production reality, yet powerless to stop it. Journalists fueled the fire, publishing rumors that the car contained unreleased GM prototypes, or that it was an entirely fabricated phantom Camaro. Every rumor, whether true or not, worked in Smokey's favor. This duality, ordinary on paper, extraordinary on track, was what made the number 13 Camaro legendary. Smokey had weaponized perception itself. By the time inspectors realized what was happening, the car was already rewriting expectations. And Smokey wasn't finished. He wanted the whispers to turn into shouts, the paranoia into fear. That's why, instead of heading directly to Bonneville, he made a detour, a carefully staged ambush at Riverside Raceway that would expose the number 13 Camaro's true menace in front of Ford, the press, and anyone bold enough to watch. The road to Bonneville should have been simple. Smokey Yunick had dates locked on the salt flats, engines tuned, and his outlaw Camaro primed for history. But Smokey never walked the straight path. Instead, he swung west toward California's Riverside International Raceway, where Ford's pride, the Bud Moore Mercury Cougar team, was quietly testing for the Mission Bell 250. To them, it was routine preparation. To Smokey, it was the perfect battlefield for a psychological strike. He arrived with no fanfare, towing the black and gold Camaro behind a battered pickup. Bugs were splattered across the car's nose, Florida plates hanging crooked, the whole rig looking more backroad outlaw than factory-backed contender. Yet the Camaro radiated menace, as if the trip across America had only sharpened its teeth. Smokey wasn't here to watch, he was here to haunt Ford on their home ground. Before long, the trap was sprung. Jim McFarland from Hot Rod magazine appeared with camera in hand, summoned by Smokey's cryptic promise of something worth writing about. A Goodyear truck arrived with fresh tires as if on cue. Then, IndyCar veteran Lloyd Ruby emerged, helmet in hand, ready to drive. It was no coincidence. This was theater, scripted by Smokey down to the last detail. Ruby slid behind the wheel, and within minutes the Camaro was tearing around Riverside. The first lap was cautious, the second quicker, and by the third, it was posting times faster than the previous year's pole. Ford's Cougars, once confident, suddenly looked obsolete. McFarland struggled to keep up with his lens as the black number 13 streaked past, its engine bellowing like artillery across the desert air. For those watching, the sight was unsettling. A car that wasn't supposed to exist, humiliating Ford's finest in broad daylight. When Ruby rolled back into the pits, sweat dripping, Smokey gave no speech, no boast. He simply folded his arms, puffed his cigar, and watched the stunned silence ripple through the paddock. Minutes later, the Camaro was strapped back to its trailer, covered with tarps, and gone like a ghost, leaving chaos in its wake. The detour had done its job. Ford was rattled, the press intrigued, and whispers about the number 13 Camaro had grown into a roar. If this machine could humiliate rivals on a road course, what would it do on 10 miles of salt at Bonneville? The stage was set, and Smokey was ready to unleash his rebellion on the world's fastest battlefield. October 1967. The Bonneville salt flats shimmered under a ruthless sun, 10 miles of white emptiness daring men to test the laws of physics. Smokey Yunick rolled in with 3 Camaros, 2 small blocks, 1 big block, but it was the black and gold number 13 that drew every eye. Whispers about its Riverside performance had spread like wildfire. Ford's engineers prayed the rumors were exaggerations. Chevrolet's executives, quietly nervous, pretended to know nothing. Journalists crowded the pits, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. For Smokey, this wasn't a record attempt, it was a siege. He had assembled a driver lineup as fearless as his engineering. Mickey Thompson, Curtis Turner, Bunky Blackburn, Johnny Patterson. Each man had stared down danger before, but none had driven a car like this. As they strapped in, the salt stretched endlessly ahead. No guardrails, no margin for error, only the horizon and the roar of an engine daring them to chase it. What followed was 12 relentless days that rewrote history. The Camaro thundered past 180 mph, its V8 screaming at 8,000 RPM as the salt exploded into white plumes behind it. Records fell one after another: flying mile, standing kilometer, endurance runs measured not in laps but in human stamina. By the end, more than 300 FIA and US SAC benchmarks lay shattered, replaced by times scribbled in black ink and disbelief. Smokey, never one for theatrics, shrugged. We kept breaking our own marks. But Bonneville wasn't conquered without blood. At speeds above 185 mph, the front end began to lift, the car floating like it wanted to escape gravity itself. Drivers returned pale, shaken, swearing they had felt death tugging at the wheel. Engines blew spectacularly, valves snapping, pistons shattering, silence falling heavy across the flats. Mechanics worked until their knuckles bled, swapping motors as if they were ammunition in a war. Yet every time the Camaro rolled back onto the salt, it demanded more, as if built not to run, but to dominate. When the dust settled, rivals weren't just beaten, they were demoralized. Ford lobbied for rule changes, the FIA bristled, and even GM distanced itself from Smokey's outlaw masterpiece. But for fans and journalists, the verdict was clear. Bonneville had never seen anything like it. The number 13 Camaro had transcended car and driver. It was now a legend forged in salt, speed, and defiance. And with records broken, a storm of controversy was about to follow, proving that Smokey's true battle wasn't only on the flats, it was against the system itself. Most racers measured success in checkered flags and trophies. Smokey Yunick measured it in discomfort, the kind he could cause the people who thought they controlled racing. To him, competitors on the track were secondary. The true adversaries were the inspectors, the bureaucrats in suits, and the corporate giants who wrote the rules. The number 13 Camaro was built not just to win, but to provoke, to expose the fragile seams of authority. Every acid-thinned panel, every raked angle, every sleepless night in the Daytona garage was aimed at one message: you can't control me. On the salt flats, Smokey had already proved his machine could dismantle records. Now he wanted to dismantle confidence itself. The fallout was immediate. With more than 300 records erased, Ford executives panicked, sending lobbyists to FIA and USAC to demand clarifications and amendments. They feared Smokey had turned their carefully crafted rulebooks into a playground. Even GM, whose badge the Camaro wore, recoiled in public, pretending distance from the rebel who had humiliated their rival. Officials whispered about investigations, rivals demanded protests, and the press devoured every rumor. Was the number 13 even a real Camaro? Did it carry hidden prototype parts? Or was it a phantom, legal only because Smokey had found a way to dance in the gray zones no one else dared touch? Smokey thrived in the chaos. He knew the records mattered less than the paranoia they spawned. Competitors left Bonneville convinced that the outlaw Camaro still hid secrets, tricks they couldn't uncover. That suspicion was Smokey's greatest victory. He hadn't just beaten them with horsepower, he had beaten their sense of certainty. The number 13 Camaro became more than a car, it was a manifesto on wheels. It screamed that ingenuity could topple empires, that one man with a welder and a rulebook could terrify corporations with unlimited budgets. But revolutions always leave wreckage. By the time the salt settled, Smokey's masterpiece was already slipping from the spotlight, whispered about, but unseen. And as the backlash grew, rule changes, investigations, and corporate denials, the car itself seemed to vanish into legend. Only years later would it resurface, battered, half-buried, waiting for someone else bold enough to believe in its defiant spirit. By the dawn of the 1990s, the black and gold number 13 Camaro existed more in myth than in memory. Racers told stories in hushed tones, embellishing each detail until it sounded like folklore. Some swore the car had been destroyed, crushed under corporate orders. Others claimed Smokey Yunick dismantled it himself, hiding its secrets from a world unworthy of them. What remained were scraps, grainy photographs, yellowed race sheets, and the reputation of a man who thrived on mischief. For most, that was enough. The legend was safer unsolved. But for Vic Edelbrock Jr., son of one of hot rodding's great pioneers, whispers of the car's survival weren't background noise, they were a summons. Edelbrock chased the trail like a detective. Phone calls stretched across decades, leads led to dead ends, but the story refused to die. Then came a tip about a Camaro buried under snow in upstate New York. When he arrived, the sight froze him in place. There it was, half hidden beneath a snowbank, paint dulled by rust, body scarred by years of neglect. Yet the faded gold number 13 still clung stubbornly to its side, a ghostly reminder that legends don't fade easily. To anyone else, it was a derelict. To Edelbrock, it was a resurrection waiting to happen. He negotiated with historian David Tom, who had safeguarded the car for years, and took the outlaw Camaro into his care. What followed wasn't restoration in the traditional sense, it was archaeology. As the team stripped away layers of grime, Smokey's fingerprints emerged. Panels so thin that sunlight bled through, welds at strange, deliberate angles no factory blueprint had ever called for. Aerodynamic tweaks subtle enough to evade detection, but radical enough to change history. Every discovery confirmed what Smokey had always preached. Genius lives in the margins, hidden where others refuse to look. Edelbrock refused to erase the car's scars. Each dent, each weld, each imperfection was preserved, because they weren't flaws, they were stories. And when the rebuilt V8 barked to life for the first time in decades, it wasn't just metal waking up. It was history demanding to be heard. The outlaw had returned, reborn not as a museum piece but as a living machine, and as it thundered once more, the question lingered. Would the number 13 Camaro now rest as an icon behind glass, or be unleashed again to haunt racetracks like Smokey intended? Today, under soft light in a controlled vault, the reborn number 13 Camaro gleams as if time itself has surrendered. Black paint, gold numerals, battle scars intact. It looks less like a relic and more like a survivor. Visitors approach it with reverence, tracing their fingers along seams, studying the windshield rake, crouching low to examine welds. Engineers arrive not just to admire but to learn, hoping to decode secrets Smokey Yunick left unsaid. Journalists still argue over whether it was genius or outlawry, and fans line up simply to hear the sound of its small block V8 thundering to life. The fascination endures because the Camaro embodies more than speed. It embodies rebellion. The enduring hook is Smokey's creed, "They never said I couldn't." That single sentence, tossed off like a joke, became the DNA of the car. Even decades later, the number 13 Camaro forces the world to confront an uncomfortable question. Where does innovation end and rule-breaking begin? When Vic Edelbrock Jr. resurrected the car, he refused to sand away its history. Each dent, each acid-thinned panel, each crude-looking weld was preserved, because they weren't flaws, they were the very essence of defiance. And when the Camaro thundered across vintage circuits in the 1990s, crowds stood silent in awe. For a few heartbeats, they weren't watching a restored classic, they were hearing echoes of Daytona in '68, Bonneville's salt screaming at 180 mph, and Smokey Yunick's laughter as inspectors fumed. Today, the Camaro is more than a car. It is a manifesto carved in steel. It symbolizes an era when motorsport was raw and unsanitized, when audacity mattered as much as resources, and when one man with a welder could humble corporations. And yet, one mystery keeps the legend alive. Smokey once hinted that the car carried a trick no one ever caught. He never revealed what it was. Some whisper it's hidden in the fuel system, others swear it lies deep in the acid-dipped chassis. The truth remains locked in silence, a final card held close even in death. That unsolved riddle ensures the legend never fades. The number 13 Camaro isn't just remembered, it endures, timeless, daring each generation to look closer, to question harder, and to push further. Because true revolutions aren't born in boardrooms. They are born in smoke-filled garages, in the hands of men too stubborn to play by anyone else's rules. Smokey Yunick's number 13 Camaro wasn't just a car, it was proof that rebellion could be engineered into steel. It rewrote records, defied inspectors, and left behind a legend that still challenges where innovation ends and rule-breaking begins. But what do you think? Was Smokey a genius innovator or a cunning outlaw? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next story from Muscle Cars Revolution.